Hello, everybody. Happy Monday and welcome to our call. Normally, Bill would be kicking this off, but he has an unavoidable conflict. So I'm certainly honored to be handling this forum and kicking off the call. And before I officially do that, I was thinking about the fact that we've got a holiday weekend coming up, and I realized, oh my gosh, this is like the first normal holiday weekend we've had since New Year's Eve 2019. Like, think of how much has happened between then and now. So you all have done so much to help our company get through from there to here, your friends, your family, your audience, your clients. So thank you for everything you've done over the last year and a half to get from New Year's Eve 19 to 4th of July 2021. And I hope you have a great weekend and have a great time celebrating. Thank you. So on behalf of the Diversity Council, the LGBTQ plus Employee Resource Group, I'm honored to introduce our employee and ally panel as we near the end of Pride Month. At Townsquare, we strive to create a diverse and inclusive culture. And today's panel will educate you on the added challenges and obstacles that our LGBTQ plus employees sometimes face based solely on their sexual orientation or gender identity. Our goal is for you to have a better understanding, so whether you identify as being part of this group or whether you'd like to be an ally for this group, you come away knowing you are not alone, and that we support you for being your authentic self at Townsquare, where you'll be valued for the contributions you make and appreciated for the person you are. So before we start, I'd like to thank our courageous panelists and moderator for sharing their personal stories for the benefit of Townsquare, starting with our moderator, Joe Heyer. Joe's pronouns are he and him. He's the Assistant Director of Content and Morning Show co-host for 94.5 PST based in Trenton. And the panelists include Jake Mitchell. His pronouns are he and him. He's an account executive for us at Townsquare Media in Amarillo. I'd also like to introduce Lex Lewis. Lex's pronouns are they and them. And Lex is a content editor for us with TSI, Townsquare Interactive. Wes Nessman, his pronouns are he and him. Wes is an ally and a brand manager, morning show co-host at Wes, I almost said W. You're on the other side of the West Mississippi, KFMX in Lubbock, Texas. I am certainly proud to be an ally. Thanks for including me today. And Joe, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Eric. It's a really powerful day to be doing this too. Today marks the anniversary of the Stonewall Riots, 1969, which kind of symbolizes the beginning of the modern day gay rights movement. So it's powerful that we're all here today. It's an honor for me to be doing this. I'm going to be serving as both moderator and a panelist, which is kind of a unique role. All of our questions have been kind of predetermined. I know the chat will also be open as well. So some of our panelists will be speaking on topics that they are comfortable on. We've gone through introductions. It's also important to know too, for allyship in Townsquare's role, we are a media company. So we not only have these conversations internally, but these are powerful opportunities we have externally for the audiences that we serve as well. So I'd like to start today's panel by asking our panelists what pride symbolizes to them, and we'll start with Jake first.
Well, in the historical sense, pride is the current state of a continuing protest that concerns the injustices that LGBT people face each and every day. Like you mentioned, the widely accepted beginning of that protest was the 1969 Stonewall riots, where Black trans performers fought back against police persecution and harassment. Stonewall's always kind of been accepted as the beginning of the LGBT civil rights movement. But to me personally, pride's a way of peacefully saying enough is enough in a way that is more celebration than confrontation. And it's a way to show joy in being one's authentic self, and a way to share that joy and create community in a world that can also often be very isolating.
Thank you, Jay. Let's go over to Lex.
So for me, Pride is a time to celebrate a person's authentic self and who they've come to realize who they are over the years, as well as the strides the LGBTQIA community as a whole has made, and the fact that we can actually celebrate Pride publicly.
And our ally, Wes. I think Wes might be muted for a second. Wes probably finding that mute button. There we go, Wes.
There you go. I'm not very.
There we go.
Very simply, I think that there are some amongst us who just need a little step up to get to where they should be and should have been all along. And I see Pride as that step. And that's where I'll leave that.
I love that. I love that step up analogy. For me, I think Pride is year round. Pride represents visibility, it represents the safe space. I think Jake and Lex said that very eloquently. I love how visible Pride becomes in June, when you're watching TV and just the logo of, the other night I watched TV Land and the logo of TV Land changed. There's some arguments internally amongst the community about, how it's become commercialized. But I can't help but think of, for me, in terms of when I was younger, how impactful seeing some of those visibility and seeing that seeing it being more mainstreamed may have done it. Pride also represents being ourselves finally, I think, too, for a long time. And this is something we'll talk about throughout this panel. We put up walls, and, something that I struggled with was who I wanted to be outwardly. So it's a time for me personally to reflect on how freeing it is and how much of a journey each and every day that I go on that I know the rest of our panel goes on and many others in our community do as well. We'll shift gears a little bit and talk about kind of coming out now. So I'd like to start with Lex and kind of talk about, what are the kinds of things that somebody who is coming out, and again, this kind of runs the spectrum of, from lesbian to gay to bisexual to transgender. I want Lex to kind of talk about their experiences in terms of coming out.
Yeah, for me and for a lot of other people, you can experience a whole lot of emotions when you're coming out. It can be both terrifying to admit it, and especially not knowing if you have a strong support system or if people will judge you or look at you differently. But it can also be liberating because you're finally able to, just be yourself. And then finally admitting that this is a part of you is also just really freeing because you can start to accept more of yourself as you embrace all parts of your identities.
Very well said. Jake.
It would help if I unmuted myself. So even in the best case scenario, coming out is a pretty traumatic experience because you have to come out to yourself first before you can even consider coming out to the rest of the world. In my case, I went through about 6-7 years of denial and really grieving over what I thought my life was supposed to be like. I come from an upbringing in a very traditional family where my grandfather was a Baptist minister, and so was my father. So coming from that to where I'm at now, it took a lot of self-reflection and growth. I'm very lucky to have a family that eventually came to support me. Not everybody in my situation can say the same, but we live in a society that champions heteronormativity, or the idea that being straight or cisgender or whatever is the default setting or the norm. When I was in high school, they actually taught us from a textbook that all families are made up of a mom and dad and kids. And that kind of creates a baseline that's, one, inaccurate, and two, it can be really damaging, and it creates a stigma that LGBT people have to constantly fight and create space for themselves or find a way to be okay with living in the background. And that's a lot to put on one person, especially somebody who's, in their formative years. On top of that, going through all of that in a vacuum because you're absolutely terrified that somebody else might find out that you're a little bit different. You have to go through all of those things before you can even start coming out to other people. So like I said, it's a pretty traumatic experience.
Yeah, for me, I think I felt like something was different, from probably the age of 6 or so on. And, you think, well, what could that be? But you just don't feel like you're fitting in. And I think Jake made a great point about, a textbook, and you see that, and well, that's not necessarily the vision for how I see myself. And you start to put walls around that. I think it's something I think that the three of us have hit on. Well, that's different. So that's not something I'm going to embrace, and you start hiding it. And, I think it's important to note, for me personally, it wasn't necessarily just a quote unquote sexual thing either. It was, so much of my identity had to do with being gay and even being queer. So if I liked something that was stereotypical, like if I liked a musical, would that be something that might allude to it, or would that be like admitting it to myself? And I had a very safe and accepting family ultimately, but still managed to spend years in therapy. So I think it's important when we have these conversations internally and both externally to remember, that you never know, even if you think it's so easy for somebody or it seems so easy for somebody. I do mentoring with a lot of LGBT youth, and I thought, oh, it must be so much easier for them, but their struggles are completely different than the ones that I knew of, when I graduated high school, 10 years ago, or a little more than that now, I guess. But it's an ongoing process, and I think it's interesting that all three of us kind of acknowledge that it begins with ourselves and that internal dialogue that's happening. So I think it's why there's so much noise around that. Shifting gears a little bit in terms of how often we have to come out, I think that's something that gets lost in the coming out process. There's not just one big, you came out and that's it. And personally, I wish that was the case. So I want to start by kind of asking Jake, what's the concept of coming out every time you meet somebody new? Well, how is it relevant, and how do you kind of work that into meeting new people?
So coming out constantly is a subject of conversation that we've discussed a lot lately. In my case, it's not something I really consider every time I meet a new person, because most of the time it's a non-issue, and it really kind of should be. But there's a point in every new interpersonal connection on whatever level, whether it's with a new client, whether it's with a new coworker, whether it's with the cashier at the convenience store on my way to the office. There's a point where that can become relevant. And we all kind of see that transition point when the conversation goes from the task at hand to more personal things, like when somebody makes a comment like, well, are you married? Well, no, that's only been legal for a few years. You kind of have to take every case as its own basis, and that's usually when I start preparing myself for that conversation.
And what is that moment like, Jake, usually when you're kind of having that conversation?
You have kind of a big yikes moment, like, oh, I'm about to have to do this again. And you also have that moment of kind of preparing yourself for the worst case scenario. We've all experienced at one point or another our own version of that, and we've all got friends and people we care about that have experienced things that are kind of intense in those situations. Personally, I've been very lucky, but I'm also a proud 6'7", 300-pound gay man. So I do have a little bit of privilege in that area, that I don't have to worry about certain things as much as others do.
Yeah, Lex, what is it for you, in the concept of coming out and in terms of how you're making that decision each and every day?
Yeah, for me, I don't feel the need to come out about my sexuality every time, just because it's not really relevant and it doesn't really come up. However, as a non-binary individual, I feel the need that I have to bring that up every time I meet someone, because people look at me and they see female. And I inwardly cringe when I get like oh, hey, ma'am, excuse me, miss, because that's not who I am. So when having a one-on-one conversation with someone, that's one of the first things I have to mention up front, just so people understand who I am and how I want to be addressed.
Yeah. Sometimes it starts there. Jake, you mentioned that you mentioned, and I thought it was an interesting way to describe, that you're 6'7", 250-pound, man, so that you don't have necessarily fears for maybe physical safety when coming out. But how does that work for you in the workplace in terms of clients? And it's interesting that you work in a more external role for the company. So how is that decision made each and every day for you when you're coming out?
So just like with anything else, it's a case-by-case basis. To kind of expand on that, I've always been of the opinion that since I'm a member of certain privileged groups, being white, being cisgender, being male, it's important to me to live authentically and to almost do that to a level of maybe sometimes a little too much. And like I said, I don't ever really worry about anybody getting physically violent or being over the top with me. but that often means that I'm the only gay person a lot of people see in their day-to-day or out in the real world. One of my biggest struggles professionally is balancing who I am and still being able to secure new clients, because there are still people here in this market, I'm in West Texas, that don't do business with me simply because of who I am. And that definitely takes a minute to shake off.
Yeah. Internally, I'm curious, Lex, since you're not as externally facing for the company in that regard, how is that in terms of coming out to coworkers, and what has that experience been like?
Coming out, I want to say I was maybe the first person on my team to come out using different pronouns. So that was scary waters to navigate. Thankfully, my team has been nothing but supportive. I haven't really had any issues. Some people, it took a minute to get there just because they weren't used to using they, them. And then I came out after they had known me as she, her for like a couple years, given how long they had been there. But I'd say for the most part, it's been fairly smooth. Having a supportive team has definitely helped, but it's still a case of making sure new people know how to address me when they start. But it's also helpful that, my managers and my team members also just refer to me as they, them, even in like random conversations. So, yeah.
In terms of our ally on the panel, Wes, what is, you're on the receiving end of some of these, and what is your process for that and kind of message as an ally?
I'm just sad that I'm still listening to this right now. I really, really am. And I'm sorry that you guys still have to go through this each day. And that's something that you're going to find is a theme that will continue with me. I don't know how to answer that question. Each individual circumstance is going to be a different situation. But my basic response is, and I'm sorry if it's too flippant, it's like, awesome, let's get to work. Let me know if you have any problems. And I understand that may not sound empathetic enough, but I want everyone within the community to know that they're going to be treated equally. And that's really all there is to it. And I understand that you face a lot of challenges and you feel like you have to push a little bit harder. And I want you to know there are people like me where you don't have to do that. You just have to show up. You're just a coworker, a friend, a pal, until you're not, and that's all there is to it. And I think that's the best way I can answer this question.
Yeah, it's interesting, Wes, to kind of follow up on that. In a past Townsquare life for me, I used to travel the country on what was the digital team, and it was a decision I had to make when I walked into our markets. And to the credit of our employees, in most cases, I was met very positively. But it was a decision I had to make walking into the building. Was I going to be out? Was I going to be myself? If I had to make a decision in terms of referring to a partner who I was dating, was I going to say my boyfriend, or was I just going to say my partner, or kind of be more nondescript about it, because I'd be coming in and would need the respect of individuals like Wes, and to Wes's credit, Wes is one of the best. It's a decision that so many of us kind of have to make, day in and day out. And then, in terms of how it shapes their opinion of somebody, both, professionally, internally, and externally. Employment law in some states still doesn't protect against sexuality and gender, and then that part of it's terrifying. And I think it plays a significant role in terms of a lot of the decisions that we're making in the workplace. Every new manager I've met, I have to wonder, is this how do I come out safely, and will this be supportive? Now, I've been very blessed in my Townsquare career that I've only had the best managers who have met that very positively. To my current managers, even now, but I've always erred on the side of finding a way to subtly do that. And that's a constant decision that we have to make. And even as an on-air talent now, I have to make the decision of how do I do that on air each day, without making it a big thing. And I know I'm also not the only one in the company that has had to make those similar decisions, but it's a ongoing thing. And again, to Townsquare's credit and to the large majority of our coworkers, it has been relatively positive thanks to individuals like Wes. Microaggressions. So we're going to shift kind of completely here a little bit. Microaggressions are statements or actions that somebody might have an indirect or might not realize they're making a comment that might be offensive or maybe triggering for a marginalized group, such as a minority. And so in Townsquare, we have a unique position that we're members of the media, our on-air talent are paid for their opinions. But for the most part, in my experience, Townsquare has been super accepting of that. And I'd be curious to ask our panelists, about some examples of when saying something innocently, is actually kind of offensive to the community and how they kind of handled that. So I think I'm going to go over to Jake first on that one.
So I'll kind of lead this off with a little bit of humor, but there is a prerequisite to being a member of the LGBT community, and that's having a thick skin. We've all heard things that kind of make your blood boil, and you kind of just have to swallow it and move on sometimes. But to me, I think one of the most hilarious is, at least you're not throwing it in everyone's face. Or it's okay that you're gay, just don't hit on me. First of all, no worries there. But to me, that whole, at least you're not throwing it in everyone's face, that sounds like a thinly veiled threat. Like, as long as you exist quietly, there won't be a problem. I've yet to figure out the way to actually respond to that, other than just kind of swallow it and move on. We talk about things that are a little more obvious, like a coworker saying something about a certain portion of our community in a very direct way right in front of you, thinking nothing of it because they just don't realize what they're saying. They don't realize the impact of those words.
Yeah. And I guess I'll go to Jake again in terms of pronouns, right? Because a lot of times this can be mocked just by introducing yourself in a different setting with pronouns. I've been in settings both professionally and socially where, and I'll open this for the whole panel as well, where somebody introduces themselves with pronouns and it's kind of mocked in that setting. How has that been for you, Jake?
So I've tried, especially in the last couple of years, to make a practice of introducing myself with my pronouns. Again, because I'm a member of certain privilege groups, being cisgender, white, male, and my pronouns being he and him. It creates that awareness and that openness for that conversation. There have been times when people have kind of made a joke of that. They don't realize really why I'm doing it, and that's fine. They don't have to, but that needs to be more normalized. But it's a pretty simple thing to follow with what somebody's asked you to do as far as how to treat them. And anytime you've been told someone's pronouns, just use the pronouns you've been told. Mistakes are one thing, but making an intentional issue and misgendering someone or using anything other than their preferred pronoun, it's pretty disrespectful, especially considering we can assign pronouns to inanimate objects like a car. It's pretty simple to follow the golden rule and just treat people the way they've asked you to treat you.
Yeah. Lex, how do you decide to speak up when in those moments?
It's really hard to tell. One of the first examples I can think of are like workplace situations. If like we're in a meeting and somebody is accidentally misgendered, maybe they came out recently and everybody's still kind of getting used to it. It's not like you can really interrupt the meeting and be like, whoa, wait a second. So in those instances, I may either DM the person who misgendered the individual and just be like, hey, friendly reminder, or I will DM the misgendered individual and be like, hey, did you want me to say something, or did you specifically say something to this person? Because you don't want to overstep your boundaries. You want to make sure that even if a person was misgendered, maybe they're not comfortable speaking up for themselves or wanting someone to speak up for them on their behalf. So it's still a conversation that has to happen that way, just to make sure they're comfortable doing whatever you choose to do.
And Lex, what is for you personally, because a lot of times it's personal, when somebody uses the incorrect pronouns, I think that can be stressful for an ally sometimes who wants to be doing the right thing and may accidentally slip up. And Jake and I have both said that in a lot of ways we feel like intent matters. What works best in your experience?
For me, just really apologizing and moving on. I can typically tell when people are trying to make that conscious effort to remember my pronouns. I hate to say that one of the churches I went to, it was LGBT affirming, but they were not used to trans non-binary individuals like myself. And I'll just define trans non-binary for a second. Transgender occurs when your gender and the sex you were assigned at birth don't match up, but it's non-binary in the sense that you're neither male nor female. You're either something else, nothing, somewhere in between. It can be a variety of things. For me, it just means something other. But I was a member of an LGBT-friendly church for a while, and they were not used to trans non-binary individuals. And I tried to work with them for over a year on my pronouns, and maybe like a handful of people were cognizant of using my pronouns by the time I left. So given that experience, I can tell when some people just don't care enough to try to remember, when some people just flat out are like, oh, that's not grammatically correct, even though, you know, I'm the one with the English degree, it's fine. Or, you know, if they're really, really trying and they're just not used to it. So, yeah.
I think intent oftentimes, and I think we put so much pressure on ourselves on allies, or I've seen allies who have tried to do the right thing and oftentimes stress themselves out more than maybe they should, if they're in the right place. So, you know, in recent years, you know, there's been some great improvements in terms of legislation and in terms of representation in the media. But I'm curious to see, because we're all sort of from different places and also from different eras in terms of the movement. I'm curious to kind of discuss some barriers, you know, that we've seen come down in our lifetime and kind of our role in those and how we perceive them. So I'll start with Wes.
Oh, well, you know, I'm very, very proud to have held the very, very first AIDS benefit that ever took place in this town back when it was still gay cancer, and people did not know if you could catch it from breathing the same air or shaking hands. But once again, the recurring theme with me is that homophobia and transphobia is nothing but bullying, and I don't stand for bullies. And that's kind of how I got involved. And then probably the reason I was invited here or was asked to be here on the part of somebody from the community was I became a minister just so that I could perform marriages, and perform the very first marriage with my cousin Ronnie and cousin Joey. And I'm very, very proud of that. So when you ask how things have changed, it's been incredible, but it's been incredibly slow. And I still find it heartbreaking, the trials that you guys have to go through each and every day, and the decisions and the micro decisions you have to make minute by minute just to exist and be accepted. It's unbelievable to me. I try to live mentally in a world where people like me aren't needed. And that's how I felt about this whole meeting. And I asked my granddaughter, why me? Why am I being invited? And the answer is the fact that you had to invite me says that people like me are needed. And that's a weird little 360 thing. But that's how far we've come and how much we've stayed in the same place all at one time. So I guess that's my answer.
Wes, I'm going to go off topic for a quick second because I'm just curious because it kind of struck me as you were talking about that. You know, you're a rock DJ, and I've known you for years. You're a rock DJ, you know, in Texas. How is there a role that you have felt in terms of, right? Because there's a lot of stereotypes that go along with that. Some, you know, so, to various degrees. What has your role been in changing minds and hearts, you know, in terms of your work too, just by being who you are on air?
Listen, I've got the same advantages of Jake, but obviously I'm a little bit more rough around the edges. I'm 6'4", I'm 265, I'm heavily tattooed. I know every biker in this town. I know every politician in this town. I know where all the bodies are buried. And I know that when I hug a gay or transphobia person in front of other people, it means something. When I stand up on the radio and say this kind of treatment isn't right, it means something. When people look at me and they say he's not afraid to, you know, to express his emotions to somebody is not the same sexuality, it means something. And I tell these stories on the air. I tell these stories. I got my hugger ability, which I have actually applied to most members of Townsquare management, believe it or not. I got it all from a biker guy. I looked over it one day and I saw this crusty old biker. They called him Santa Claus, and he had a yellow beard. And I was actually one of those people who was afraid of touching people because of germs. I saw him come into a club, this crusty guy, and hug every single person in that club. It didn't matter whether they were a man, a woman, gay, straight, trans, whatever. He hugged everybody. And I looked at that guy and I said, that's the guy I want to be. That's the guy I want to be, and I don't care what anybody else thinks. I want to be the guy that spreads that kind of love within the community, within all communities. And that's part of the reason of who I am, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it's interesting for me, you know, I stumbled into being on air in Townsquare. You know, I had a digital background at the company. And stumbled into being on air. And, you know, after my first break, I remembered when the mic came off, my co-host said to me, we weren't sure if you wanted to come out or not. So, you know, how we were going to do it. And it sort of happened organically. And as recently as last month, I've gotten notes, and you'd think, you know, we've talked about, you know, Jake's referred to being in West Texas and some stereotypes there that might come along with that, and some feelings that you might instantly assume with that. I mean, I'm in a fairly liberal city in Princeton, New Jersey, smack in between, you know, the I-95 corridor and stuff. And last month I got another note from somebody who said they've lived in the community for 60 years. And it's so nice that on air, we're not just doubling down on, oh, Joe is gay and this and that. It's just Joe has a bad dating life and Joe had a bad date or whatever. And it just fits in terms of that. And, you know, I think, and I don't say that to pat myself on the back, but I think when I was young, you know, thinking back to, you know, watching Will and Grace and kind of sneaking that from hiding that, or watching Queer as Folk and not letting my parents know that I was watching programs like that, you know, with limited role models in pop culture, I think it was tough. And knowing, you know, that there's individuals, you know, like Wes and other people. And again, I know I'm not the only one in the company either. It's really nice to sort of see us be connected in that way. And I guess back to my original question, which we had a good conversation on that, to Jake, sort of the question again of, you know, what have you seen in the past 20 years in terms of, you know, legislation and the media and some barriers that you've seen come down, and where are they now?
Well, obviously the Supreme Court marriage decision, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the repeal of the Defense Against Marriage Act, or Defense of Marriage Act, whichever. And then, of course, the expansion of the Civil Rights Act here recently to include sexual orientation. But there's still a long way to go. LGBT people still have little access to healthcare programs, mental health care programs. most physicians have no idea how to treat an LGBTQ person. They have no training in that. They think it's just exactly the same as a heterosexual person. Access to aid programs for people who don't really have any kind of familial support early in life. A lot of people lose access to those, lose access to their caregivers through no fault of their own. And it would be nice to see programs exist that help them get back on their feet and become members of society. But we're going to continue this fight until people get behind the idea that there is no default setting for being straight or gay or whatever. Everything in life is a spectrum, and until we can all get behind that way of really intersectional thinking, we're going to continue to have a fight on our hands. Yeah.
And you said something that, I just had to explain literally to my parents 2 weekends ago over Father's Day, that I didn't come out to my healthcare provider until I was 29. And that was finally when I had sort of taken the ownership for that. So it's everything across that. Lex, what barriers do you still think exist?
I would say barriers for, I guess, legislation and policies involving trans non-binary individuals, and even just lack of general education as to like when to use they them pronouns or other alternative pronouns for an individual, as well as just making people aware that that's an option, as well as just teaching people not to really assume. I'm not entirely sure what would be the best way to go about that, but I do know that just the assumption of looking at someone and mentally going, oh, that's a she, when it's like, no, they're probably a they, or maybe they're actually a he. I think those are still barriers that we need to cross to really make more effective change.
And Lex, sorry, what's a myth? It's getting late in my day. What's a myth about you that you want people to sort of better understand? I think that's kind of a good transition to that.
Mm-hmm. One myth is that, well, I guess two myths. One myth is that sexuality is set in stone, as well as gender. Sexuality and gender both are more fluid than people realize. I know in particular, I haven't talked about my sexuality on this panel yet, but I identify as asexual, which is defined as a lack of sexual attraction to any individual. The reactions I get from explaining that to certain people are priceless. But anyway, for people within the asexual community, they can identify as strictly asexual. They could be gray asexual, whereas they may feel sexual attraction every now and then or under a very specific circumstance, or even demisexual, where they have to have like a strong emotional bond before they can experience that. So even within the asexual community, it's a spectrum. And even people can fluctuate in between one or the other. Sometimes, depending on the day, I've met people like that. And I can imagine that it's the same for, allosexual or non-asexual individuals as well.
And Lex, in some of our, conversations leading up to the panel, you had mentioned something, about your journey in discovering that. And I think that's something that gets lost in the, I don't want to say the education part of this, but it's something I think that those that aren't as familiar don't realize that it wasn't like you switched like a light and was like, that's the identity that I identify with, right?
Right, no. And even for me, I feel like I discovered my gender before my sexuality. And then even after I came to terms with my sexuality, I'm not also what's known as aromantic, like a lack of romantic attraction to anyone. But it took me even a couple years after finding out I was asexual to find out that, oh, I'm not just exclusively attracted to males. This is new. So yeah, it happens in stages, and even people can find out more about themselves at different times. So
yeah, I think that's I don't want to say a stigma, but I think it's something that there's this assumption that we all know it all the time, and we don't. It's a growth process that happens for us. Jake, what's a myth for you? A myth about yourself that you want people to sort of better understand, or about our community?
Well, so to kind of give a little bit of backstory on what I'm about to say, we actually had a local business owner purchase a series of billboards here in town with some very directed biblical verses on them, specifically placed in the month of June for that reason. And so really, I want to address the particular myth that that individual believes in, and that's that being different doesn't make us distasteful or deviant. Being gay doesn't automatically make you a pedophile. And yes, there are still a lot of people that believe that for whatever misguided reason. But we have hopes and goals and dreams just like everybody else, and they may not look the same as yours, which is fine. That's kind of what makes the world so beautiful, that people want to chase things in all kinds of different directions, and that really none of us want any kind of special treatment. We just want the same respect and opportunities and the ability to be ourselves in a way that a lot of folks take for granted.
Yeah, beautifully said. For me, I think a myth, that I often come up with is, and I think I said this before, is being gay, and I think even the term that I started to really embrace for myself is queer. It has very little to do with the dating and romance part of it for me, and it has more to do with the so much of who I feel that I am, and the community that I feel I represent, and the community that I feel like I fit in best with. So I think that there's a myth that it has to do with the sexual aspect or the romance or the dating part of it, and it is so much more to do with who we are each and every day. Talking in terms of the workplace, I'm actually going to probably wind up putting Wes on the spot here, so I'll give him a bit of a warning for that. How can we build a better atmosphere of inclusion so all employees can feel supported to do their job? As I said before, I think intent matters. So if someone makes a mistake in terms of pronouns and stepping into something that was unintentional, I think that matters. But Wes, is there anything from your perspective as a company and in a workplace that we could do to help make more employees feel supported at their job? Because I think you have a unique role of kind of, you've probably heard from some who have said, maybe you were the first person who accepted them.
Well, all I can do is tell you, personal experiences. Not only do I, am I a part of this company, I also run haunted houses, and I have about 120 kids each year that work for me, and a lot of them are trying to figure out where their place in this world is and what it means to them. And all I can say, and all I really want to put in under the guise of this question, is please be patient with those of us old guys who are trying. When I hear you use the word queer, it's still very uncomfortable to me. To me, that's something you'd never call a person. So the definition of that word is changing. So we're trying to accept that. And for Lex, I would say some of us old guys, we're cheaters. I would probably call you Lex until I got used to, or until my brain gets used to the grammar change of they and them. I work with a person who prefers they and them 3 or 4 times a week, who has actually changed, I guess, I don't know how to say this properly, and I hope you guys correct me, has changed their name from a female name to a name with a broader name. He or they or them is now known as Sirius. And that's how I cheat. I just call them by that name, because it does take quite a bit of repetition to be able to change those pronouns. So it's not always disrespect. So please be patient to those of us who are trying, and we're going to learn. But those two things that I just brought up are very much related when you think of us older people and the way we were brought up. I think it's wonderful that you took a word that used to be pejorative and you now putting positive connotations to it, but it's going to take a little while for some of us to be able to use that comfortably. when addressing you.
Yeah.
Is that fair, Lex? What would you? Well, I really honestly have been thinking this whole time. What would you think of me if I referred to you as just Lex instead of using they or their?
Honestly, I'd be fine with it because to me that also proves that you are trying, if nothing else, while you're adjusting, you're trying to remember that I don't go by she, her, and that you don't address me as female. So I would probably honestly be thrilled that, even though calling me by my name solely might be a little awkward, but at least you're trying. And like you said, it's definitely a learning curve and an adjustment, and it does take time, but that is one example of people I can tell are genuinely trying. So
That's all I wanted to express on that one. Thank you.
Thank you both. Jake, you were kind of an integral part in forming the LGBT plus employee resource group. So I'm curious if you have any experiences of other companies and other practices, in this space of inclusion.
So since we kind of got this resource group up and running, I've had the benefit or rather the blessing of being connected with individuals at other companies like Amazon and AIG and a few others. Simply having these groups is a huge step in making LGBTQ plus people feel more valued at work. Some of the other things that a lot of companies are doing are kind of small, simple gestures that can have an entire conversation without ever having one. Among that is, putting your pronouns in your email signatures, actually celebrating Pride at work, having safe zone training, and that kind of information accessible. And I have to massively say thank you to the HR team and the leadership team with Townsquare Media for all that they have done to open this dialogue.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. In terms of that, I think that brings us to what's kind of a good conclusion in my final prepared question. There are plans to send out a sign that employees can tape to their workspace that says they're an ally. So I want to ask all panelists what that would mean for them if and the sign will say, I'm an ally in a safe space. So I'll start with I guess I'll start with Lex.
I'd say bring it on. I'd be very, very proud to fly that. Make it big. Make it really large. Put it up. Send it on. I'll post it. I mean, I don't know what else to say on this. Anybody that feels uncomfortable for any reason is welcome to come to me. And I guess I have I'm a little bit more sensitive to some issues than others. But anytime anyone wants to express that's fine. Yeah.
Great. Lex?
For me, I would personally be very happy if I were to see like, hey, I'm an ally. That would probably mean that, I can come talk to you, or if nothing else, send like gay memes or something. So we'd have something to talk and joke about and things like that. So.
And Jake?
So for me, coming from a conservative part of the world over here, the more rainbows I see, the more I feel seen. There's still that 12-year-old kid inside of me that went through a lot of stuff at that age. And I feel like if that had been more pervasive, more around when I was that age, I might have had an easier time going through that process. There's a lot of talk about like rainbow capitalism and the practice of corporations, courting the community in the month of June. And, some of that stuff may have some basis in profit generation, but it still makes me happy because, like I said, that 12-year-old kid inside me that thought he was broken for so many years feels valid, feels seen.
Yeah. Something that I meant to mention earlier, I think even in the opening is how much more likely, LGBT youth are for risk of suicide and for bullying and all that goes along with that. And so that those tiny steps of visibility, though they might not seem like it in your day to day, it means the world. And I can only imagine, the feelings that, the three of us must have had at those ages, and what I see in terms of in the community where I mentor and stuff. For me, last year was the first time I saw the Townsquare logo with the rainbow, and I've been with the company now more than a decade, and that meant a ton. I saw an executive recently with their pronouns in their signature, and that meant a ton. So the things that we do each and every day that seem tiny, I think, do matter. And on behalf of myself, I guess I'm going to say that it means a ton, and I notice it, and I know I'm probably not the only one, and I know in our employee resource group we are noticing those things as well. So those tiny gestures do go a long way. And with that, that's the kind of the conclusion of our prepared portion. But I believe there were some questions, so I'm actually going to toss it over to Alyssa.
Thank you, Joe. And before I thank everybody on the panel, Emily, could you share each question and we'll see if we can answer them?
Yes. So the first one is, my city had its first ever Pride this past weekend. Yay. Some people I know that lived here had never attended any kind of event like this before and were hesitant to do it at first. As more cities start to support the LGBTQ plus festivals and events year round, what advice would you have for both allies and members of the community about supporting and attending these events for the first time?
Would anybody on the panel like to answer that?
Just go. Just go, take a lot of pictures. That's my advice. I've been to so many different local Pride events, and I've had a great time, and with wonderful people just out to have a great time. It's odd to me that anybody would feel uncomfortable after they've been just once. So I would say just go, take a lot of pictures, share those pictures. You could use them to make a mega gallery for Townsquare or a nice post. And you could kill two birds with one stone. You could open minds and take care of some of your day-to-day job duties.
That is excellent advice. I don't know if anybody has anything they want to add, but that is great advice. And as having been to the New York City Pride Parade, it is so much fun. And I would encourage anybody who's ever in New York City at that time to definitely go, because you've never seen anything like it, and it's amazing. Anybody want to add anything else?
I'll jump in a little bit. So I spent several years over the last decade or so planning Pride events. And one of the things that we put together was a know before you go kind of checklist. And it was intended for folks that it was their first event that may not be part of the community, to kind of give them a little bit of a frame of reference. And there were really only two statements in it. And the first one was to kind of be prepared to experience a completely different culture that you may have never seen before. And keep that frame of reference in mind. You may see things that make absolutely no sense to you, that you have questions about, and that's fine. But don't let yourself make yourself uncomfortable with things that you don't know about without having a conversation and just asking. Most people are open to having those conversations as long as you're being respectful. And the other part of that was to tell people to just have fun. Pride events are about sharing the joy that is being yourself, and everybody has a piece of that. Everybody has a part of that.
Excellent points. Emily, can you share the last question we have?
Yeah, we've got one that asks, is it generally safe to come out to your care team, or are there still plenty of people in the medical world that don't know how to handle a patient coming out?
I think for each of us, this answer may vary, but speaking for myself, I had to do a ton of research, and I live in a big city, but there are healthcare needs that come up with that. That there are terms and things that they just aren't in their day-to-day world. So yeah, for me, in terms of finding a healthcare provider, and I live in Philadelphia, a large liberal city, it took until I was 29 to finally do that. And I will say, it turns out there are more resources out there than even I realized, than just straight up Googling and stuff. But it does take some time, yeah.
And Alyssa, we do have a few more coming in, so I'll go ahead and keep asking if time allows. Aside from making monetary donations to things like the Trevor Project, what are some ways that allies or members of the LGBTQ plus community can mentor or be more involved with youth groups that are struggling with their sexuality? Anybody have one for this?
I can kind of jump in on this because not every city is going to have organizations that are focused on that. So here in Amarillo, we really don't have anything to that effect. So I would say find your local PFLAG chapter. That's PFLAG. It stands for Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. That organization has a playbook for supporting youth. If there's not a chapter in your community, network with people on social media and try to help get one started. Building that net that catches people that may otherwise fall through it is the only way we're going to help stay ahead of youth suicide rates. That is something that's always going to be a grassroots issue.
And then the last one I have is thoughts on using the use of singular they, them for all individuals.
I guess I'll jump in on this one. I think that's an ongoing conversation that we need to have, because I would be perfectly fine for it, but I'm also biased. So for cisgendered individuals, that might not be comfortable for them, just because that's not how they identify. I think it is definitely a good safety net at the beginning, but like I said, I think it's warrants a conversation as to how to best approach someone if you don't know.
Thank you, Lex. Well, our time is just about up, and before we end, I do want to first of all thank Wes for being an ally and spreading love. You know, he's just an inspiration, and just hearing him speak and his enthusiasm is contagious. And I feel like if somebody never really thought before about how they can make a difference in other people's lives, and especially in our community, which is the power of Townsquare, you've seen it firsthand, which always gives me so much pride in working for Townsquare, and I'm sure everybody feels the same way. Second, I do want to also thank Emily Gomez, who's our producer, and she does such a great job. So thank you so much, Emily, as always. And third, to our panelists, Jake, our moderator, Joe, and Lex. I mean, you do make it sound easy and seem easy sharing yourselves, but the reality is, as you shared, it's been a lifelong journey to get to this place where you're comfortable and maybe not even, maybe still a little bit scared to go in front of the whole company and share your story, which is such a personal one. But I am so confident that you are making a difference into educating people. People who couldn't join today will be listening to the recording, and it's really hard not to interact with you without feeling engaged and wanting to be your friend and wanting to be your coworker. So I do think that it's just a reminder, hey, we're all people. We all have unique characteristics, and we also all have some commonalities. And one thing is, we're all part of the Townsquare team, and you all definitely have made my life better for having to know you, and also are members of the LGBTQ plus employee resource group, but also as coworkers, you definitely make Townsquare way better. So thank you so much for being here today, for volunteering, for taking your time, and for making Townsquare better. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day, and celebrate the last few days of Pride Month. Thank you.